It was supposed to be a typical family dinner. The kind where everyone gathers around, eats too much, and talks about anything but the things that really matter. But as I sat there, passing dishes and exchanging polite smiles, I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't quite right. The tension was thick, but no one spoke of it, no one dared. James, my husband, sat across from me, trying his best to seem at ease, but I could tell. His usual smile was a little too forced. His eyes darted nervously whenever they landed on his brother, Daniel. I wasn't sure what it was exactly, but the air felt heavy in a way that made my skin itch. The laughter around the table was loud, but not genuine. It was a polite charade, the kind of laughter you hear when people are too uncomfortable to face the awkwardness that lingers just below the surface. Daniel was the source of much of the conversation, as usual. He always had a way of making people smile, drawing them in with his charm and effortless charisma. He was the golden child, the one who had everything figured out. I couldn't help but admire him in a way. He was the kind of person who could light up a room just by being in it. And then there was James. My sweet, earnest James. He had always been the quieter of the two, the one who lived in the shadow of his older brother. It wasn't that he wasn't successful, or that he didn't have his own qualities. It was just that, somehow, he always seemed to come second. To be compared, constantly, to Daniel. And I could see it. I could feel it in the way James spoke, the way he held back just a little bit more than usual when Daniel was around. I tried to lighten the mood. I was tired of the distance that had been growing between us. You know, I said, half-jokingly, maybe I should have married Daniel instead. He's got all the charm, the looks, the charisma. You'd have been better off with someone more, like you. I smiled as I said it, hoping to make it sound playful, but even as the words left my mouth, I realized they were more cutting than I'd intended. There was a pause. The room seemed to freeze for a moment, and all eyes turned to James. He was staring at me, his face unreadable, his lips pressed tightly together. His gaze flickered briefly to Daniel, then back to me. The smile I had worn so casually faltered, my stomach tightening as I realized something was wrong. This wasn't just a playful remark to him. James stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and everyone fell silent. "I need some air," he muttered, his voice low, almost cold. He didn't look at anyone as he walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The silence at the table was deafening. No one spoke. No one moved. I sat there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. I hadn't meant to upset him. I didn't even realize that what I said could hurt him so deeply. Daniel, always the mediator, cleared his throat and gave me a small, tight smile. "Don't worry about it. James, he's just got a lot on his mind lately." I nodded, but his words didn't offer much comfort. What had just happened? Why had he reacted that way? I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a misunderstanding, a simple joke gone wrong. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. Something that had been brewing for a long time, hidden beneath the surface. I excused myself from the table and followed James outside. The cool night air hit me as I stepped onto the porch, but I barely noticed it. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. James was standing at the edge of the yard, his back to me, his shoulders stiff. I hesitated for a moment before approaching him, unsure of what to say. "James," I began, my voice soft, "I didn't mean to upset you. It was just a joke." He turned to face me, and I saw the hurt in his eyes, something deeper than I had ever seen before. His expression was a mix of anger and something else I couldn't quite place. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if struggling to find the right words. It's not about the joke, Lily, he said finally, his voice tight. It's about everything. About always being in his shadow. About never being good enough. I blinked, taken aback. What are you talking about? I'm talking about Daniel, he said bitterly. You think I don't notice? You think I don't see the way everyone looks at him? How they compare me to him, how he's always the one they want to be around. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. This wasn't about a joke. This was about something much deeper. Something I hadn't realized was so ingrained in James. He had always been the quieter, more reserved one, but I never thought it had gone this far. I never imagined he felt so inadequate, so overshadowed. I never wanted to be like him, Lily, James continued, his voice shaky now. I never wanted to compete with him. But it feels like I have to. And it feels like you want him, too. Like you'd rather have him than me. My heart sank. I could feel the weight of his words, and the guilt began to settle in my chest. James, I don't want him. I love you. You know that. He shook his head, his face hardening again. It doesn't matter. Not anymore. I don't know if I can keep pretending like everything's fine when I'm always being measured against him. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I realized just how much pain James had been carrying for all these years. This wasn't just about one comment. This was about years of feeling less than, of being compared to someone who seemed to have it all. And I had never known. I had never understood the depth of his struggle. I didn't mean to make you feel this way, I whispered, stepping closer to him. I didn't know. I'm sorry. James didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the yard. I stood there, numb, staring into the darkness, as the weight of the night settled heavily on my shoulders. I had no idea what was coming next, but I knew one thing for sure, everything had changed. And I wasn't sure I could fix it. I spent the next few days trying to make sense of everything. James hadn't spoken to me much since that night, and every time I tried to approach him, he would pull away, his body language colder than I had ever seen it. I couldn't blame him, but it hurt all the same. I had no idea that a simple comment, a half-joke, could unravel everything between us. I had always known that there was some tension between James and Daniel, but I had never thought it was this deep. I always assumed it was just sibling rivalry, harmless and fleeting. I didn't realize that James had been carrying that weight for years, living in his brother's shadow, feeling like he could never measure up. I never saw it. I had always been so focused on our life together that I didn't realize how much pain he was hiding behind that quiet exterior. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating. Every conversation felt strained, and every look exchanged between James and me was loaded with unspoken words. I couldn't stand it. I wanted to fix it, to make things right, but I wasn't sure where to start. I didn't know how to reach him when he was this distant. It was early morning when I found myself standing in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of coffee. I hadn't slept well the night before, my mind replaying the conversation with James over and over, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. I could feel the tears threatening to spill again, but I held them back. I had no right to cry. I had caused this. I was the one who had made everything worse. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps behind me broke my thoughts. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. I could feel his presence even before he spoke. Lily, James's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. I swallowed, trying to steady myself before turning to face him. James, I replied softly, my heart pounding in my chest. I had been waiting for this moment, hoping for it, but now that it was here, I wasn't sure what to say. He stood there for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. I could see the hurt and confusion in his expression, but also something else, something I hadn't noticed before. It was a vulnerability I hadn't seen from him in years. It made my chest tighten, and for a moment, I was afraid he might shut me out completely. "I'm sorry," he said finally, breaking the silence. "I shouldn't have reacted the way I did. I know you didn't mean it the way it came out, but it still hurt," I finished for him, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his gaze falling to the floor. "I don't know why it hit me so hard. I guess I've been feeling invisible. Like I'm not enough. And when you said that, it made everything worse." I felt a pang of guilt in my chest. How could I have been so blind to his pain? How could I have been so thoughtless? I reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm, trying to bridge the gap that had grown between us. "I didn't know," I said, my voice breaking. "I had no idea you felt that way. I never meant to make you feel like you weren't enough. You are enough, James. You're more than enough. I love you." He met my eyes then, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something, hope, maybe, or maybe just the beginning of forgiveness. But before either of us could say anything else, the sound of a car door slamming outside interrupted us. Both of us froze, and for a brief second, I wondered if we could pretend that nothing had happened. But that was impossible now. We couldn't go back to how things were before. I turned toward the window, my heart sinking when I saw Daniel's car in the driveway. Of course, he would show up now. I hadn't seen him since the dinner, but I knew that his arrival would only complicate things further. I glanced at James, who was already looking away, his jaw clenched tight. "I'll go talk to him," I said quietly, trying to offer some sense of normalcy. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready." James shook his head, though, his expression hardening. "No, I'll do it. I have to. It's time." I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but I could see the resolve in his eyes. I knew he had to face Daniel, to deal with the tension that had been simmering between them for so long. I just didn't know if this was the right time. But then again, when was the right time? I followed him outside, staying a few steps behind as he walked toward Daniel's car. Daniel was already getting out, a grin on his face that quickly faded when he saw James's expression. It was a look I'd seen too many times before, the mask of forced politeness, the attempt to appear unbothered by the tension between them. But it didn't fool me. I could see it in both of their eyes. "James," Daniel greeted him, his voice light, almost too light. "Good to see you, man." "Yeah, good to see you too," James replied, his tone flat. There was an uncomfortable silence between them, one that hung in the air like a thick fog. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. I stood off to the side, unsure of whether I should step in or just let them figure this out on their own. Finally, it was James who broke the silence. "We need to talk, Daniel," he said, his voice low but firm. "About everything." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, I thought he might back away, but he didn't. He simply nodded. "Yeah. I think we do." I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to take a turn I wasn't prepared for. The weight of the conversation that was coming felt heavy, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was any way for things to go back to normal after all this. Could they fix this? Could James and Daniel ever be the same again? As James led Daniel toward the porch, I stayed behind, my heart racing in my chest. I wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but I knew that everything was about to change. Again. I only hoped it wasn't too late. The conversation that followed was uncomfortable, to say the least. I had hoped for a moment of clarity, for some sort of breakthrough, but instead, the tension only seemed to grow with every word exchanged between James and Daniel. I stood at the door, watching as they took their seats on the porch, both men with their arms crossed, each trying to hold their ground in a battle of pride and hurt. "I didn't mean to hurt you, James," Daniel said, his voice quieter than usual, a slight edge of something I couldn't quite place creeping into his tone. "You know that, right?" James didn't answer immediately. He stared at his brother for a long time, his eyes cold but pained. I could tell he was fighting to keep his emotions in check. "You never had to hurt me, Daniel. You just did it without realizing. Or maybe you did realize, but you didn't care. It's not like I was ever good enough for you, was I?" Daniel's jaw tightened, his face hardening as if James had just struck a nerve. "I never said that," he muttered, his voice laced with defensiveness. "This isn't about you not being good enough. It's about everything else." I could feel the weight of their words pressing down on me from where I stood. I wanted to go to them, to stop the conversation before it got any worse, but something held me back. Part of me knew that they needed to work this out on their own, but another part of me was terrified. Terrified that it was too late for any of us. "I've been trying, Daniel," James continued, his voice growing softer, the hurt there now undeniable. "I've been trying so damn hard to make you see me. But all I've ever been is your shadow. And you know what? I'm tired of it. I'm tired of being the brother who doesn't matter, the one who gets overlooked. I thought, maybe, if I could just be enough for you, things would be different." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly not expecting this confession. "That's not what I wanted, James. I swear, it's not. You've always been enough for me. But, you don't get it, do you?" James's eyes flickered with confusion, a shadow of frustration crossing his face. "What do you mean, I don't get it?" "Everything's always been a competition between us," Daniel said, his words slow and measured, as if he were trying to make sense of them himself. "I never asked for that, James. But you keep making it that way. You think I don't notice? You think I don't see how hard you try to one-up me? You think I don't feel the weight of your expectations?" I could feel the tension between them thickening, the air suffocating in its heaviness. It wasn't just about the moment anymore. It was about years of silent resentment, years of misunderstandings, of unspoken emotions that had festered into something much larger than either of them had anticipated. James looked away, swallowing hard. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never knew you felt that way. I thought if I just kept pushing, kept trying to prove myself, maybe you'd finally see me. Maybe then you'd actually care." The vulnerability in James's voice hit me harder than I expected. All this time, he had been carrying the weight of feeling invisible, of never being good enough for his own brother. And Daniel, in his own way, had been struggling with the pressure of being the one who was always seen, always in the spotlight. Neither of them had truly understood the depth of what the other had been going through. And now, here they were, finally on the same page, finally facing the truth. But was it too late? I watched them, a lump forming in my throat. I wanted to tell them that everything could still be fixed, that they could still repair their relationship, but I wasn't sure how. I wasn't sure if they could undo all the years of hurt and neglect. Maybe it was too much to ask for, too much to hope for. I had always believed in their bond, believed that no matter what, brothers would always have each other's backs. But this was different. This wasn't something that could just be swept under the rug. "I never wanted to be the one who made you feel like you didn't matter," Daniel said after a long pause, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot how to be your brother. I got caught up in my own shit, and I stopped seeing you. I stopped seeing what you needed. James's gaze softened, though the hurt was still there. It's not just about needing you, Daniel. It's about being seen. You've always been so wrapped up in your own life, in your own success, that you never noticed what was happening with me. It wasn't just about competing for attention. It was about the fact that I felt like I didn't even exist to you. Daniel looked down, shame flickering across his face. I see that now. I see it, and I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. There was a long silence between them, one that felt like it lasted an eternity. I could feel the weight of their words hanging in the air, the rawness of their emotions making everything feel so fragile. For a moment, I wondered if I had been wrong to get involved. Maybe I should have stayed out of it, let them sort it out on their own. But then, I realized that sometimes, people need a little push. Sometimes, they need to know that they're not alone in their struggles, that someone cares enough to make them see each other, really see each other. Finally, James spoke, his voice quieter, softer than I had ever heard it. Maybe we can start over. Maybe we can try to fix this. But it's going to take time. Daniel nodded, a small, hesitant smile forming on his lips. Yeah, it will. But I'm willing to try. If you are. James didn't answer right away, but when he finally did, his words carried a weight that felt different, like a promise. I'm willing to try. And just like that, something shifted. The tension between them wasn't completely gone, but it had lessened, just enough to make room for healing. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, though I knew this was just the beginning. They had a long road ahead of them, but maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. I couldn't help but feel a sense of hope rising in my chest. Perhaps, in the end, we all could find our way. The tension that had been hanging in the air began to dissipate after that night. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of cautious optimism. James and Daniel were talking again, really talking, without the walls they had built around themselves. It wasn't easy. There were moments of awkward silence, moments when they both seemed unsure of how to proceed. But there was also something else, a sense of raw honesty that I hadn't seen between them before. Over the next few days, things slowly began to change. James started coming around more often, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. He'd bring his guitar and play a few songs for me while Daniel watched from the kitchen, pretending not to care but always listening. It was strange, this new dynamic. There was an unspoken agreement between them, a sense of understanding that had been absent for so long. The first time I caught them genuinely laughing together was a turning point. They were sitting in the living room, James with his guitar in hand, strumming out some old classic rock song, while Daniel teased him about his terrible taste in music. The laugh that followed was real, deep, unforced. I watched them, my heart swelling with something I couldn't quite name. This was what family was supposed to be. This was the connection I had been missing, the connection that had been shattered years ago by misunderstandings, by words left unsaid. It felt like everything was falling into place. But of course, nothing in life is ever that simple. It didn't take long before the cracks began to show again. Subtle things at first, slights, small miscommunications, but they were there. I noticed it the most in Daniel's demeanor. There were moments when he'd glance at James as if he wasn't entirely sure how to feel about him. And I could tell James noticed it too. One evening, after a quiet dinner, the silence that had been brewing all day finally erupted. Daniel had been unusually distant, staring at his phone rather than engaging in conversation. I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just a phase, but I knew something was off. James, ever the sensitive one, was the first to bring it up. "Daniel," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "is everything okay?" You've been kind of distant lately. Daniel didn't look up from his phone, his fingers moving rapidly over the screen. Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired. James's eyes narrowed, clearly unconvinced. You've been more than just tired. You've been avoiding me. What's going on? I could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air, the tension building once again. Daniel's fingers stopped moving, and for a moment, he was silent. I could see his jaw tighten, his shoulders stiffening. The familiar distance that had been between them was back, and I was helpless to stop it. I don't know what you want from me, James, Daniel finally said, his voice low, almost defensive. You keep trying to fix things, but I don't know if I can just forget everything that's happened. James's face softened, a hurt expression crossing his features. I'm not asking you to forget, Daniel. I'm asking you to move forward. To stop holding everything against me. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. Move forward? How can I move forward when every time I try, you throw something else in my face? The words hit me harder than I expected. There was so much unsaid between them, so many years of resentment that neither of them had fully dealt with. It was like they were standing on opposite sides of a vast chasm, each one waiting for the other to make the first move. But neither of them seemed willing to take the leap. I'm not perfect, Daniel, James said, his voice almost pleading. But I'm trying. I'm trying to make things right between us. Daniel's eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else there too, regret, maybe even fear. I don't know if I can do this, James, he muttered, more to himself than to his brother. I don't know if I can ever see you the way I did before. There was a long silence between them, thick with unspoken emotions. I felt like I was intruding on something I wasn't meant to witness. I wanted to step in, to say something, but I knew this was their fight. This was something they had to work through themselves. I had no right to interrupt. I don't want to go back to how it was, James finally said, his voice steady but strained. I just want us to be okay again. I don't want to lose you, Daniel. Not like this. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind that speaks louder than any words ever could. And then, Daniel spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can do that, he said, his eyes cast downward. I don't know if I can just let go of everything that's happened. I felt my heart drop. This was it, the moment where everything could either fall apart again or finally start to heal. But it wasn't just about James and Daniel anymore. It was about me, too. The way I had watched them, the way I had hoped things would change, and the way I had put so much of myself into their relationship, trying to make everything better. But sometimes, I realized, no amount of hope could fix something that wasn't ready to be fixed. The night wore on, and the silence between the three of us grew unbearable. I knew they needed time to process, time to think, time to figure out what they wanted. So, I left them alone, slipping away into the night, giving them space to breathe, to sort through their emotions. The next day, James came to me first. He had that familiar look on his face, the one that said he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. I could tell he had been thinking about our conversation all night. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his voice full of guilt. I shouldn't have pushed so hard. I thought I was doing the right thing, but maybe I've been too much. I shook my head, trying to reassure him. James, you're not the problem. You've always cared, even when it seemed like Daniel didn't. But you can't change everything in one night. You have to let things happen at their own pace. He looked at me, his expression softening. I just want us to be okay, you know? I don't want to lose him again. I nodded, understanding more than I could say. And you won't. But you have to give him the time he needs, just like you need time too. It wasn't the closure I had expected, but it was a start. James and Daniel still had a long road ahead of them, but they were no longer standing on opposite sides of an insurmountable divide. They had started to understand each other again, to see the humanity in each other's struggles. And for the first time in years, I believed that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to the bond they once had. And as for me, I realized that I wasn't just a bystander in their story. I had played a part, too. And while I couldn't fix everything, I could support them, help them find their way. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. For now, that was all any of us needed.